Welcome to Search the Scriptures with Dr. Eugenia Constantinou, adjunct professor at the University of San Diego. Our aim is to provide interesting and accessible Orthodox Bible study for busy people. Here's Jeannie.
The Orthodox tradition is to interpret the Bible according to the Fathers. What qualified someone to be considered a father in the Orthodox Church? The Fathers were saints who were highly educated men, the leading thinkers, writers, and theologians of the Church. Now, the Fathers were not generally trained for an ecclesiastical life. In fact, most of them were educated for secular careers, and some of them had very successful secular careers until they left the world to serve the Church. And among these are Jerome, Gregory of Nyssa, Ambrose, St. John of Damascus, and others. Other fathers also received a secular education, a very excellent education, but at a young age, before they actually started a career, they decided to become monks. We see this in the case of Chrysostom, Basil the Great, and Gregory the Theologian, who, while still in their teens, while still involved in their university studies, had decided to become monks. Now, most of the fathers were bishops, even though very often they did not want to be bishops. Many times they did not want to be ordained at all. They wanted to live a quiet monastic life, but the Church called upon them because of their great brilliance, their many talents, their skills in oratory, and their great holiness. So the Church called upon them, recognizing these talents, and ordained them. Some of the fathers were not bishops, but were presbyters. Others were monks, and yet others were laymen. Now, the fathers helped to express and define church doctrine. They defended it against heresies, that is, a false teaching. They defended it from attacks by pagans and Jews, because they were constantly attacking the church during these eras. The fathers wrote many treatises on moral topics, such as virginity. They also wrote many books explaining the Bible. In fact, however, many of the writings which we consider commentaries about the Bible, that is, a book which explains the Bible verse by verse, are in fact not written down by the fathers, but they were sermons which the fathers delivered to their congregations. And because they were famous orators, people like Jerome or Chrysostom, as they were preaching, stenographers wrote down what they said. Then later those were put into books and published. So many of the writings of the fathers which we have are actually sermons. In addition to these types of writings, theological treatises, etc., we have many letters by the fathers when people wrote to them asking for spiritual advice or direction, or they wrote with a theological question, and the fathers gave their answers. So we have hundreds of letters from different fathers. Now, what qualifies someone to be called a father of the Church in the Orthodox Church? These are the general standards understood among the Orthodox. First, brilliance of mind. Obviously, they weren't ordinary thinkers. Second, orthodoxy of doctrine. They were not a father if they taught heresy. Third, holiness of life. The father had to have died as a saint. And fourth, Catholicity. That is, he had to belong to the Church, that he could not have been a schismatic. Now, Roman Catholics do not have the same standards. Practically any ancient church writer is called a father of the Church by the Catholics. Let's see how Orthodox standards compare to the Catholic understanding, one at a time. First, brilliance of mind. Of course, the Catholics agree with us on this one. The fathers are the outstanding thinkers and writers of the Church. But after that, the Catholics depart from us. The fathers are not as important to the Catholic Church as they are to us, because for us, the the fathers stand as authorities in the church. For the Catholics, of course, authority lies in Rome. We often see the fathers quoted in papal documents, but of course the decision of the Pope is what is important. That's where the authority lies. But for us, of course, the authority lies in the fathers. So perhaps that's why the Catholics aren't quite so picky about whom they call a father of the church. I'll give you an example. The second requirement, orthodoxy of doctrine. Catholics call Origen a father of the church. Perhaps you have never heard of Origen. His name is spelled O-R-I-G-E-N. He was a brilliant man, a great writer of the church and preacher. He was a presbyter who lived in the first half of the 3rd century. He wrote thousands of books and was extremely influential in the church, but he made some serious theological mistakes. He's a very important early Christian writer, but much later, about 200 years after his death, he was condemned by the church for his errors. Rightly or wrongly, many people think it was a great injustice. But nonetheless, he was condemned by the church. So for the Orthodox, it is not appropriate to call him a father, but the Catholics still call him a father of the church. Now what about holiness of life? Another person who is considered a father of the church by Catholics, but who isn't one for the Orthodox, is Clement of Alexandria. Now many Orthodox don't know that Clement of Alexandria is not a father of the church within the Orthodox Church, and that's because he does not meet the criteria of holiness of life. Clement died around the year 200. He was a teacher in the school of Alexandria. In fact, he's the one who preceded Origen there. He may have been a saint, but the fact is we know virtually nothing about his life. And because of this, he is not on the canon of saints of the Orthodox Church. People have said that he is, but the date that they give are the dates for other Clements, such as St. Clement of Rome. Now the fact is, we don't know anything about the life of Clement of Alexandria, so he is not a saint. We don't make people saints whom we don't know anything about, and if he is not a saint, then he is not a father. Now what about the standard of Catholicity? Well, interestingly enough, the Catholics don't observe this requirement either. They accept as a father of the church a famous Latin writer, Tertullian, who died as a schismatic. That is, he was once a member of the church, but then he left and joined this break-off movement called Montanism and died outside the church. So Tertullian is not a father for the Orthodox, but the Catholics still call him a father of the church. Now Catholics also add another requirement which we do not have, and that is antiquity. For someone to be called a father by the Catholics, he had to have lived in the first few centuries of Christianity. They end the era of the fathers with John of Damascus, the 8th century, that is. We do not have the requirement of antiquity. In fact, we have many fathers from the 18th and 19th centuries, such as Theophan the Recluse, Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain, St. John of Kronstadt, etc. So we don't limit fathers to simply the ancient fathers. Now that we know who the fathers were and what makes them a father, let's talk about what it means to interpret the Bible according to the fathers. But when we embark on our Bible study, I'm not going to cite the fathers extensively every week, especially when we are giving the introduction to the Bible, when we're talking more about the historical aspects of the Bible, the formation of the Bible, etc. I have spent a lot of time thinking about what it means as Orthodox Christians that we interpret the Bible according to the fathers. can we interpret the Bible according to the Fathers without quoting from the Fathers? I would say yes. According to the Fathers does not mean that we explain the Bible primarily by quoting the Fathers. When the Fathers themselves used the phrase, according to the Fathers, they did not mean quoting the Fathers who preceded them. They meant according to the tradition of the Church. As long as one is in line with holy tradition, one is interpreting the Bible according to the Fathers, because the Fathers were the ones who personified that tradition. And that's why they're important, not as sources of quotations like proof texts. So, conversely, let's say someone quotes the Fathers but does not use them or understand them properly. Is he Orthodox? Of course not. I'll give you an example that really illustrates this point. This came to my attention recently. Someone told me that Mormons are now using the Fathers to support Mormon doctrine. The Mormons are very anxious that they be accepted as Christians by real Christians. And of course, Mormons are not Christians. In fact, they are polytheists. They believe in the existence of many gods. They also believe that God the Father, the one whom we pray to, was once a human being just like us, but he elevated himself to the status of a god. And furthermore, if a man lives a good Mormon life, he too can become a god himself, equal to God the Father. Now the Mormons are supporting this because they're supporting this by quoting the Fathers, because they want to prove that they have some connection with early historical Christianity. And of course, they have no connection to Christianity. They popped up by themselves in the 19th century America. So what are they doing? They are pointing to the patristic doctrine of theosis, deification, to support the Mormon doctrine that human beings can become God. That's abhorrent. It is an abuse of the Fathers. Not only is it heresy to say that we can become God, literally gods, not God-like, because the Fathers are not saying that we become actual gods, but that we can become God-like. We can imitate God. The fact is that Christianity teaches that God has always been God. He has never been a man. And we have always been creatures, and we will never be God. We will never be anything other than creatures. In fact, Mormon doctrine is not only heresy, but it's blasphemy to say that we can become equal to God. And yet they're using the Fathers to support their doctrine. So does that make them Orthodox if they find lots of Fathers to quote? Certainly not. That's ridiculous. So there are many reasons why, according to the Fathers, does not mean that we restrict our explanation of the Bible to only what the Fathers had to say. And here's why. The Fathers themselves did not simply repeat what those before them had said. They used their minds, their education, and all of the resources and information available to them to interpret the Bible. That is the patristic tradition. Furthermore, there are some books of the Bible for which we do not have patristic commentaries. Does that mean that we are not to read or interpret them because we don't have any Fathers to quote about those books or to tell us what they mean? Of course not. Sometimes a Father also skips over a detail which you wish he would have explained. Does that mean that we cannot arrive at an understanding on our own that is informed, something which we have decided upon from study? Fathers also addressed a specific audience. Very often they were giving a sermon, so their words reflect their times, their pastoral consideration, the need of their congregation, the heresies which were rampant at the time, and other details which happened to come to their mind while they were preaching. So we don't restrict ourselves only to what the fathers said because they were addressing a specific situation at the time. We also don't restrict ourselves only to what fathers have already said because the fathers did not exhaust the meaning of the biblical text. Chrysostom was absolutely adamant on this point, and he repeated himself when he made this point, and this is what he said. It is not possible, I repeat, it is not possible to exhaust the meaning of the Bible. Well, if it's not possible to exhaust the meaning of the Bible, dear brothers and sisters, then certainly we cannot simply restrict ourselves to what the fathers have already said about the Bible, because the fathers themselves did not exhaust the meaning of the biblical text. Now, this does not mean that some understanding which we arrive at about the meaning of the text is correct, may not be correct. But that doesn't mean that we are limited to only saying what the fathers have already said. The fathers themselves also tell us to study the Bible on our own. It is in fact an insult to God to not study the Bible and to apply our own mind, our own intellect to the study of the Scriptures. The fathers used their entire education. They used aspects of even their pagan education to apply to the understanding of the Bible, because they were educated in many things, not just in theology. They learned astronomy and mathematics and history and philology and grammar, etc., and they applied all of this to interpreting the Bible, and they expected us to do the same, because their theological and spiritual insights simply cannot be matched by us. The fathers were holy, and because they were close to God, their understanding of the biblical message is so much deeper than what we can arrive at on our own, because we're not simply studying the Bible from a historical perspective. So the fathers have an understanding of the Scriptures, especially its spiritual message, which is much, much higher than what we can attain on our own. How are we to use the fathers then? First, we must read the fathers carefully and wisely with discernment, because, just like the Bible, the fathers themselves can be misunderstood and distorted. Now, of course, on matters of dogma, such as the nature of Christ or the Holy Trinity, they were in agreement. But on some things the fathers were not in agreement, and occasionally they expressed an opinion which was a little bit out of line and is not in agreement held with other fathers. So they may stand alone, or maybe one or two fathers express a certain opinion. And theologians call this a theologumenon. This is a matter of opinion held by one or perhaps a few other fathers. A theologumenon does not have the same weight as a teaching which is widely held among the fathers. So we must be careful not to find one thing that this father said and then use it to support a whole theology, because it may be something which is incorrect about and condemned. Others believe that Gregory may have held this belief. However, it is okay to read him, but we simply ignore this little teaching of his that is incorrect. And so one person who said this is Saint Photios the Great. So he says, well, Gregory may have said this, but we just read everything else and we ignore that aspect of his teaching. So we must be careful as Orthodox Christians not to become patristic fundamentalists, that just because we find one thing in the writing of the fathers, we understand that literally and we adhere to it as though it is absolute truth. There is also no such thing as patristic infallibility. The fathers were human. They were saints, but they were not perfect, and only God does not make mistakes. So occasionally we see little mistakes, usually very minor things among the fathers, but we can't insist that just because a father said something, especially on a historical matter, interpreting the Bible, this does not mean that they are absolutely correct and perfect, because there is no such thing as infallibility in the Orthodox Church, except, in the manner in which we understand it, the Holy Spirit guiding the Church as a whole. But overall, we can rely upon the Fathers as authentic witnesses to and the guardians of holy tradition. So, along those lines, it's important that when we are drawing conclusions and citing the Fathers, we consider the totality of the patristic witness before we draw conclusions. We do the same thing with the Bible. We may find one verse in the Bible that seems to run contrary. This is where the Catholics went wrong with St. Augustine, and I'm going to discuss him specifically in a moment. But to help you understand that my point of this podcast is to lead you from a simplistic understanding of the Bible and the Fathers to a more complex and nuanced and mature one. When you were young and you asked about heaven, your parents may have told you, well, heaven is a beautiful place where there's lots of grass and beautiful flowers and your friends are all there and you get to play all the time. Or perhaps if you discussed God, your parents may have told you that God is in the sky looking down on you, watching over you. But when you got older, hopefully you replaced these notions with more mature ones, because heaven is not like a park and God is not an old man in the sky. It is appropriate to explain things like this to children because they cannot understand abstract concepts. So we give them these images that are more concrete, that they can understand. Now, many of us have never really left the childlike and simplistic notions we have about the Bible, because no one replaced those understandings with something which is deeper, more mature. And that's what I'm trying to do when I'm explaining the Bible to you and these things about the Fathers. So, along those lines, let's talk about Augustine. A factor to consider, which certainly hindered Augustine, is that he did not have the benefit of a theological education. He did not read Greek well, so he didn't read the Greek Fathers extensively, and he tried to figure out answers to theological questions which had already been resolved in the East. But he did this not by his theological education, which he didn't have, but through his training as a philosopher and a rhetorician. So he began to use philosophy and reason in arriving at theological conclusions, and that was a departure from the established tradition of the Church. In the East, we do not use reason. We don't reason our way to theological conclusions. But even that was not really the problem. The problem about Augustine arose because of the way the Latins used Augustine. They relied on him almost exclusively for their theology, because he became the great Latin father. He so eclipsed all other Latin fathers in importance, in his brilliance, in the number of writings, in the variety of topics that he addressed, that no one in the West even approaches him. So he was so outstanding that the Catholics, and before they were Catholics, the Latin Christians, relied on Augustine almost exclusively, and sometimes they exaggerated his teachings to the point where they actually distorted what he was trying to say. Now, the East had many great fathers, so they were able to balance out the opinions of the fathers, because, as I said before, the fathers didn't always agree on everything. So the East had many great fathers to read, and this gave a more balanced understanding. But in the West, they primarily read Augustine because he wrote in Latin, and that's what the people in the Latin West read. So he became the standard for the West, and they really relegated the Eastern Fathers to a secondary position and did not read them, so they didn't have a balanced view of the theology of the Church. This was certainly not intended by Augustine. Now, as with the other fathers who make an occasional error, and I had mentioned we can, so let us conclude by summing up what it means to interpret the Bible according to the Fathers. According to the Fathers does not mean that we are limited to simply quoting the Fathers and saying only what they have already said. Rather, according to the Fathers means that we are in line with the Fathers, that is, consistent with holy tradition. According to the Fathers means that we read them, we use them, and we honor them as our guides in the interpretation of the Bible, especially in the areas of theology and morality. According to the Fathers means that we've also followed their example and advice about how to study the Bible by learning about the context in which the scriptures were written, the archaeology, the history, geography, grammar, etc. The Fathers did not draw their conclusions about the meaning of the verse from their imaginations, dear brothers and sisters. Certainly the Holy Spirit did inspire them. But when they ascended the pulpit to preach on the scriptures, they were well prepared. They had studied. They were already holy men. They were already educated, already brilliant, but they studied the Bible in preparation for their sermon, and they continued to study the Bible seriously all their lives. That is the patristic tradition. That is the Orthodox tradition. They advised us to do the same. So let us truly study the scriptures according to the Fathers by imitating their devotion to the serious study of the Bible. So together we can be inspired by what we learn when we search the scriptures.